Readers, listeners, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in Spanish and French literature. I am really excited today to dive into The Antidote by Karen Russell. This was a book that I just happened to pick up from one of the tables at my local independent bookseller. And honestly, I was drawn by the name Karen Russell. I had loved Swamplandia. I picked it up, turned it over, read some of those blurbs, which happened to be by people like Lauren Groff, Kaveh Akbar, Tommy Orange. I mean, this was like really in my wheelhouse. I also was very interested in this idea of another book that is exploring the experience of essentially the genocide of the Native American peoples. I also was drawn to the idea of another big fat book. Sometimes you're just in the mood to really dive into something, that's just very serious and seems very long and is really going to captivate you over a long period of time. I'm going to say right at the top, it was a bit of a mixed bag. There were parts of this book I really liked. There were parts of the book that I did not like quite as much. Today, importantly, we're not going to have any spoilers. This is actually a decent lecture to listen to before you read The Antidote, because as I was reading, one of the things that I recognized and was most interested in is her use of magic realism. So what I thought we would do today is to really take a look at how magic realism functions and how it functions specifically in this book. We're going to talk about the uses of it, and where it is really supporting what she is trying to do, and other times where it is falling a bit short. Those of you who like an agenda, we're just going to dive in. We're going to talk about magic realism in general. We're going to touch very briefly on sort of the touchstones of magic realism, which are Gabriel García Márquez's 100 Years of Solitude. And then I like to include Isabel Allende's The House of the Spirits. I paused there because I was going to say La Casa de los Espíritus, but we're gonna do this whole thing in English, people. We're going to talk a tiny bit about the difference between fantasy and magic realism. Magic realism gets bandied about a lot as a term in ways that honestly just like sometimes really annoys me. So it's not like a deep dive into the definition, but we're really going to take a look at what an incredible vehicle it is, essentially for talking about oppression and post-colonialism and the experience of marginalized people, which all fits extremely well with this book. And through this lens of magic realism, we're obviously going to touch on a lot of different aspects of the novel itself. This was a book that to me mostly felt kind of overambitious. It just felt like there was too much stuff. Some of it felt kind of anachronistic. It felt like kind of like this weird melding of elements that didn't quite gel. And in part that was frustrating because so much of it seemed worthwhile. I mean, I have a little list of things here that she's touching on that all seem so important to me, and that we're all really engaging. So we have difficulties of farming, which sounds kind of dull, but it was not in fact dull in her hands. We have violation against women. We have women's rights in general. My handwriting is so small, I'm having a hard time reading it. Actually, for those of you who are on the YouTube watching me squint at this tiny little piece of paper, you're also maybe noticing that I'm wearing like a little pinafore dress, a little jumper dress. The reason that I am wearing this is because I made it. This is a book that is set in it's a Dust Bowl era. It's in the 30s in the United States. And I actually was kind of shocked at how much stuff in my closet seemed somewhat appropriate for the Depression era. I have a lot of sweaters that have a lot of holes in them, that kind of thing. But I decided not to lean too far into that and to lean a little more into, a pioneer woman mindset, because I'm back into sewing. All of you fiber artists out there who might know that I'm quite the knitter, I also have dipped a toe back into sewing. And actually, I'm quite pleased with the results here. So this is my nod to the Depression era, when people really were having to make their own clothing. In fact, this looks like it could have been some sort of curtain material that I took down a la The Sound of Music and fashioned into this little pinafore dress. But back to the book. So actually, that was perfect because we were talking about women's rights. And, it would mostly have been women who were sewing the clothing back then. Not exclusively, but yes, mostly. So we've had difficulties of farming, rights of women, violations against women, politics of pregnancy. Then we also have a good, strong look at the criminal justice system as it functioned then, which is a very interesting strain of the book. It's not a large look at the larger criminal justice system, but a sort of smaller microcosm. We have a really good depiction here of difficulties of the immigration experience. We have quite a bit of looking at the experience of being a Black woman at this time and racism. And sort of down on my list is what I think is one of the driving forces of this book, which is the experience of genocide, the incredible injustice. Injustice is not even the word. The horror that settler colonialist forces wrought upon the native peoples. So the reason why it's down in my list is because it comes, in my opinion, a little too late in the book. The book is maybe 400 pages. We're not really delving into the question of the native peoples until, sort of a quarter to almost a half, maybe a third of the way in, which again, to me felt a bit late. It was something that I was looking forward to hearing, and it really is a large part of the book. And I felt like I really wanted to delve into it earlier and a bit more thoroughly. So before we dive into looking at the antidote proper, we're going to take a very quick look at the difference between realism and magic realism. So realism is a mode of writing. It's actually very familiar to all of us, anyone who's reading a lot of fiction these days, because the realist novel is essentially, sort of your like normal everyday novel. It really found its footing in 1850-ish, in sort of middle of the 19th century. A lot of people date it from the publication of Madame Bovary. What came before it in the 18th century, during the Enlightenment period, there were a lot of essays, there were some epistolary books. I'm just beginning The Scarlet Letter right now, and what a trip that book is, you guys. We're gonna dive into that guy soon. But Hawthorne had been writing before, and it's not kind of, in some ways, it's not properly a novel. And what he wrote a lot of sketches, he wrote a lot of kind of episodic stuff. He actually wrote a lot of something called a romance, which came from the French tradition, which is like an ancient kind of French tradition. But this idea of a piece of prose, like a long-ish piece of prose, but instead of focusing on everyday life, it's really focusing on issues of the heart. So with actually a pretty good dose of moralism, which really, helps you to understand the Scarlet Letter. But realism, starting in 1850, which is a bit after that, which also happens to be the year that The Scarlet Letter was published. We have the publication of Madame Bovary, and that sort of kicks off this realist novel. The point of the realist novel was to create an entire world. It really was to talk about everyday things. And the way that most of the realist writers are doing this, think Steinbeck, think Henry James, think Flaubert, certainly. The way these people are doing this is by having an enormous amount of detail. So we're hearing, what these people are eating. We're hearing how they're having sex. We're hearing what their clothing was like and how they got it. We're reading about their toilets, like all sorts of different kind of mundane things in order to create a whole entire world. This effort was very democratizing, which is important. We're not just talking about, very specific individuals or the upper classes or science. We are here talking about the experience of everyday people. And, a lot of these realist novels are concerned with kind of upper crust people, but they're also concerned, with the whole kind of breadth of humanity. So later in modernism in the 20th century, we start having different modes of narration. But in this mode from sort of 1850 to sort of 1910, we have this like kind of standard, traditional, very, pulled back, somewhat objective third-person narrator. This is important because we have it also in magic realism, and it plays a very important role there. So one of the things that this omniscient narrator does, this pulled back third person narrator, is it plays the role of sort of like a god. This is back when people were wrestling with the idea of God and the idea of predestination and destiny and determination and faith in general. But the idea that somebody was sort of in control of our lives is echoed by this idea of this third person narrator. So then when we talk about magic realism, which really came into its own in the 1970s with the Latin American boom, which, as someone who studied Spanish and French literature, it was one of my favorite aspects of my graduate studies, was really digging into that era. What happened with people like Gabriel García Márquez and 100 Years of Solitude was that he took this omniscient narrator and he took this very real world with all of its different details. It's a world readers can step into and really feel like it's a very convincing world. He took all of that and then he added some supernatural elements. One of the really important pieces of magic realism is that in a magic realist novel, the things that are happening that are supernatural are totally, believed in and taken for granted by all of the people in the novel. So a couple of examples just to clarify this. In 100 Years of Solitude, at one point, one of the themes of the book is progress and whether or not progress is good. So in that book, we have this kind of idyllic town, which is called Macondo, and it is in the jungle in Colombia. And it's sort of like the birth of a town. They're like starting over from scratch. And the question is whether it's better to live sort of in harmony with nature or to have scientific progress. So at one point, someone arrives with this new invention, which is the magnet. And as they're pulling the magnet down the main street, the magnet is pulling all of the metal pieces out of the houses. So nails and hinges and all of these things are getting sucked out into the street. It is obviously a critique of progress. You can understand that right away, which is actually very important because a lot of what magic realism is doing is giving us these metaphors that are actually very weighted. They're very polemical. He's really against progress in lots of ways, Gabriel García Márquez in that case. Another example is that one of the matriarch of the novel, who happens to live for 100 years, when one of her sons dies, the way that she finds out that he has died is this little rivulet of blood leaves him, across town, and it sort of runs all through the town. It's jumping over curbs and crossing streets and whatnot, and is arriving at Ursula, and she's like, oh my gosh, wait, that one of my sons is dead. But the important thing here is that this like line of blood that is coming across town, Ursula is not like, what the hell? What's this, line of blood that somehow jumped over curbs and made it all the way to me? That supernatural element is not impressive to her. The only thing that is impressive there is the fact that one of her sons has died. So we can distinguish that from like a horror novel where supernatural things are happening, a la Stephen King, and everybody's freaking out because these things are so remarkable just because they are phenomena that people are not used to seeing. In the case of magic realism, things are sort of taken for granted. Some of them are remarked upon, certainly, but people are not like horrorized by a lot of what is happening. Importantly, in the case of 100 Years of Solitude, Macondo is this kind of fableized town. I don't think that's the word, but it's a town that stands in for any town. It's kind of a generic town in some ways. It is a generic Latin American town, and we see the impact of the colonialists of Spain and of other European forces, but in this kind of very generalized way. It is a comment, absolutely, on colonialism, but in this kind of general way. We're not talking about specific figures. The reason why the House of the Spirits is important to me is that, and there are lectures on this, you can watch both of 100 Years of Solitude and of the House of the Spirits. What Isabel Allende does, which I absolutely love, first of all, the whole thing is much more matriarchal, which I really appreciated. There's some very strong women in that book. But the other thing that she does is she situates it a little bit more concretely in the Chile of the late or the mid-70s, when we have the coup d'etat and the overthrow and Pinochet. So in that, we have, it's not totally, like she's not using names of politicians and different figures, but we have someone called El Poeta, who is very clearly a stand-in for Pablo Neruda. So Gabriel García Márquez has this very kind of generic way that he is portraying the world. And then with Isabel Allende, we have it sort of more politically charged because she is setting it in the world of Chile in the 1970s. The reason I am mentioning that is because in the Antidote, we have some of these kind of fantastical elements, and I'm going to get to why it's not fantasy in one second. We have these supernatural elements that are occurring in the Antidote. And what I love about Karen Russell is, to me, it's kind of an extension of these two, which there are lots of reasons why it's not an actual extension. In many ways, the House of the Spirits is sort of in conversation, in dialogue with 100 Years of Solitude. The Antidote is not in dialogue with those books from the Latin American boom. But the reason why I think of it as an extension is that Karen Russell has taken some of the magic realist elements and made it even more specific. It is definitely set in a specific time. She actually has a lot of history interwoven in ways that make it very, very concrete. In fact, one of my issues with the book is that there is this very kind of freewheeling mixture of historical elements, like actual historical elements, together with fiction. We will discuss the limits of that soon. But I really applaud the way that she's using these magic realist elements to really shine a light on the issues that I named before, the difficulties of farming, racism, misogyny, certainly the experience of Native peoples. All of that becomes even more specific than, for example, Isabel Allende's use of like El Poeta. We have very specific things in Karen Russell that situate it and make it even more, I think, polemical, and even more of a book about politics, and even more of a statement about marginalized people and their experience, which is really one of the things that magic realism does best. This actually seems like a decent time to just talk quickly about historical fiction. I love historical fiction when it is done well. I think sometimes it can feel very contrived. And actually, in this book, I did have a number of different places where it felt like Karen Russell was structuring things, so she could insert these historical facts, these historical passages in ways that felt a little too convenient. It did not feel like these things were growing organically out of the story. I also had a little bit of an issue with pacing. So when you have, for me, one of the extreme examples of amazing historical fiction is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. In that book, we have like a very even feel. It's a little bit hard to describe, but as we are moving through, everything is fictionalized. We don't have her kind of stepping out and saying, having a character describe like a book where we learn about history. Everything is simply presented to us in the same sort of plane, in this fictionalized year of the life of William Shakespeare and his family. And these people are very identifiable, but we don't have a narrator that's kind of pulling back and giving us facts and figures. And I would much rather, if we're going to have fiction, I would much rather be immersed in a fictional world and get sort of up close. Hilary Mantel, obviously, another giant of historical fiction. I love her work. And there you have a much broader scope, but you still have the sense everything is kind of fictionalized to the same amount. We're not having, scenes that are very detailed and then pulling way back and having historical information given to us in these other vehicles. This does get us back to this idea that, to me, the Antidote just seemed like too much. It was too full of stuff. And part of that was because there was a lot of inconsistency. We have a young character who is on a basketball team, and we delve pretty deeply into her interpersonal relationships with her teammates. But then we also have these long passages where we're talking about, statistics, and they're given to us in ways that are sort of sewn into the book, but not as well as I might have liked. And that is why, in many ways, I wanted to look at this book. I mean, I could have done a lecture on the Antidote and historical fiction, but in that case, it would have been maybe like why the book did not particularly work well as a book of historical fiction. What with all of its disjointed nature and all of the different strands and the sort of different level of fictionalization in these different strands. But what it does do well is use this magic realism. So before we look very closely at the magic realism in the novel, I want to talk about the ways that authors can use magic realism sort of most effectively. One is to sort of articulate the unthinkable. So, for example, in 100 Years of Solitude, there's a lot of terrible sex and rape writing in that book. And in some ways, it's very difficult to read, but some of the exaggeration and some of the magic realism elements speak to the unthinkable sort of horror of rape. So there are ways that magic realism can sort of articulate things that are really awful, which clearly would give Karen Russell a vehicle to speak about the experience of genocide of the native peoples. It's a very good way to critique any sort of regime. In Gabriel García Márquez, there's definitely he's talking about the invasion of the capitalist Americans. He's talking about European colonialism. He does definitely criticize the different Latin American regimes, and it's amazing because it's very confusing because, in fact, these are regimes that were flip-flopping as Latin American forces were trying to take back their countries from the colonialists. So in Karen Russell's book, the idea of criticizing these subtler colonialist forces, these people these immigrants who are coming and are sort of convinced by the American government that they can come out and prosper on these plains, the American government does not come across looking great in this book for many, many reasons. I think she does actually an excellent job of showing the ways that immigrant populations were really kind of doing their best to reestablish themselves there, without fully understanding that they were, taking part in a genocide. One of the very best passages in the book that I really loved the most was she drew a parallel between the way that the Polish people were being essentially assimilated and really trying to be sort of wiped out by the German and Austrian forces, and why so many Polish people wanted to emigrate to the United States. That was an amazing example of, she didn't use a lot of magic realism in that case, but she is definitely critiquing the way that the Germans and Austrians were making life so miserable that these people were leaving. And the way that paralleled the experience of the native peoples in the United States was really interesting. It is also, though, another example of how far-reaching this book is. I really loved that section, but I also was like, gosh, wait, it's feeling a bit far afield for me. Speaking of far afield, in order to concretize this a little bit and make it a little bit more specific for you, one of the supernatural elements or the magic realist elements is the fact that one of these Polish farmers, Harp Oleński, while everything else in the area is this kind of dust bowl, literally, his fields are glowing. They have this kind of supernatural glow, and they happen to be growing like gangbusters. We have a lot of beautiful green stuff growing in his fields. And I don't think that is spoiling anything. That happens relatively early in the book. But that's an example of the kind of supernatural element, the kind of magic realism that we see in the Antidote. And speaking of regimes, obviously magic realism during the Latin American boom would have everything to do with the post-colonial critique, this idea of colonization as being really very bad. And I think sometimes in the United States, we forget that we really, subtler colonialism is kind of what we're calling it now. And I think because, we came over here and then we declared our independence, we somehow don't see ourselves as colonizers. And yet, in many ways, we did, sort of functionally just go ahead and colonize the entire United States at the price of really, the extermination of an ancient group of people who had been here for millennia. The last thing quickly, in terms of the ways that magic realism functions in these books, is it's often a very good way to undermine order. I mean, you can imagine that like the supernatural is inherently disruptive. So the ways, and actually the example of the magnet, being pulled through Macondo is a good example of that. If everybody thinks that progress is good and we have this idea that the Enlightenment is really like the beginning of modern civilization and science, I mean, obviously I am a huge fan of science, but there are ways that Enlightenment thinking led to racism and it led to all sorts of bad things. And one of those is that there's real faith in order, that order is always good, when in fact order can be very destructive depending on whose order we are talking about. So the idea of using magic realism to undermine order is really great. So we're going to go ahead and dive into a few of the magic realist elements that we see in the Antidote. I mentioned one, which is Harp Oleński's field and how it is growing, so happily while the rest of his neighbors are really suffering. We also have this sentient scarecrow. So we have this scarecrow that survives the dust storm and this scarecrow that in fact has a voice throughout the novel, which is obviously unusual. The idea of a scarecrow who is kind of a living, feeling creature. I really loved this element and the way that it functions in the novel, especially at the end of the novel, I really enjoyed. I will argue that it took a little too long to get there. But I really loved the whole notion of the scarecrow, and that's definitely an element of magic realism. But the things that I think stand out most clearly to me in terms of elements that were subversive and feel very much like the sort of politicized magic realist elements that are most interesting are the idea of the vault and the idea of the camera. So I really loved this. Obviously, the title of the book is The Antidote. I think it's a fine title. I don't like love it even after having finished the book. But the one thing that title absolutely does is it entirely focuses, not entirely, but it really focuses a lot of our emphasis and energy on this one character who is known as the Antidote. She is known as a prairie witch. She is something that is called a vault. So throughout the book, we meet a couple of different people. We have this one main vault woman, and this is very much a magic realist kind of notion. It is this idea that you could have a woman absorb your memory, and you no longer have that memory. It no longer torments you. People also gave her good memories, which I'm like, I don't fully understand why you would give away a good memory. That was a question that wasn't entirely answered for me. But this notion of being able to give someone your memory, and you could actually, in the way that this functions in the book, these vaults, is that you could go and get it back if you wanted it. So that vehicle, that idea of someone who could absorb the memories of someone else because they are too painful, is such an interesting concept for the idea of people who have helped in this genocide. I mean, if we as Americans, there is this like such gigantic collective amnesia, and there is so much painful stuff that we wrought as an American people that it's fascinating to think of this idea of sort of more in a more concrete way. This is a metaphor for all of the ways that the history books and that people's family stories and that American fables and like the entire idea of like the American dream, all of that stuff is forgetting a very important and a very painful aspect of what it is to be American. And I loved the way that the notion of the vault really points out that kind of collective amnesia, the way that we as Americans are really wanting to forget. One of the issues that I had with this is it got a little too wide-ranging. Again, I felt like the book there just was too much stuff. the way that the book is structured, we have people who are coming and giving individual memories, lots of which I wasn't entirely, sort of invested in. I didn't know the character well enough to really care about the memory. At one point, we have Harp Olensky's grandfather making a deposit in the vault. And so we have this long chapter, essentially, that is just his story. This is one of the ways that Karen Russell is giving us history. But to me, it didn't feel organic enough. It didn't feel like it was growing naturally from the story. It felt sort of like it was plunked in because she wanted to tell us the story of Harp Olensky's grandfather. And in fact, that was a very clear example of someone who sort of unwittingly became part of genocide. So the function is good. I just didn't love the execution. And the way that the vaults are treated in the book is a very good example of the way that a lot of magic realism is just sort of taken for granted. Everybody's just like, oh yeah, they're these women and you can go tell them your memory and they'll keep it for you and it will be totally erased and it won't bother you anymore. And then you can go back and retrieve it with a little ticket. So that's the way that these sort of unusual things are taken for granted. The other element that felt like very much like magic realism to me is this camera. People did remark a little more on sort of the strangeness of that. This was a camera, talk about unorganic. This is a camera that our young Black government paid photographer finds in like a pawn shop. So her camera breaks and she goes and she finds this new camera. It just, happens to be in this pawn shop, and it happens to be this incredible camera that allows her to look through time. Which again, I don't think I'm giving too much away here. I wish that we had had that introduction earlier. This doesn't come until, a couple of 100 pages, or at least 150, maybe 200 pages into the book. And it's interesting what these photographs show, but again, it felt like a little bit contrived. I also kind of was thinking, like, do we need both of these elements? Do we need the whole idea of the vault and the idea of the camera? It was sort of, there was like a lack of parallelism. Like one of these things was visual, the other was about memories. I mean, I think you can argue that cameras are, capturing memories, but there just was something about it that made me feel like these two things were like weirdly kind of in competition. It also felt a little contrived when those two women got together, the main vault that we have and this photographer. There are lots of ways that the novel felt very convenient in certain elements. Speaking of photographs, one of the elements that I liked most about this book was the inclusion of photographs. So from the beginning, we have these really provocative photos. There's a writer called W.G. Sebald, and I read his books, decades ago, and he uses photographs in the most unusual way. I think he's Austrian. They're just kind of these kind of orthogonal images that are just set in the pages. It's not like you have the shiny chunk of, like in a biography. It's not like a shiny chunk of different pages that are in the middle of the book. These are just scattered throughout. And most of the time they don't have a caption. They are just, and they don't necessarily correspond with what you're reading. It's really thought-provoking and interesting. And I loved that element in the Antidote. From the start, these photographs very notably have black dots on them, which was very intriguing to me. And I actually liked the way that she resolved that and the way that she explained why that was happening. Those images were some of my favorite elements of the book. I also really appreciated in the end that she had a photo credits thing and it told you where these photographs came from if you wanted to learn a bit more about them, which is actually a perfect segue into one of the elements that I was frustrated by is she has an acknowledgement section and she has the photo credits thing and there's like a further reading kind of section in the back. But when I was first entering into the world of the novel and we would have something that was historical, I would look to the back to see if there were notes. I'm a big fan of explanatory notes. So in a novel like this, where you're presenting a lot of historical information and it is melded and sort of set into this fictional landscape, it's very helpful if the writer is sort of delineating what of this is historical. Like in the very beginning, I looked at the back to see if there were notes because I wanted to know that like in the United States, I'm imagining this is kind of like having seances and mediums and stuff. I was like, were there people who actually believed that we had women who could absorb your memories? I didn't actually believe there were women who could do that. But I was like, I don't know, maybe there was a phenomenon or a very small set of people who were experimenting with this idea of transferring memories. So I went to look in the back to see if this was a thing. And in fact, there are not notes that speak to what of these things are fictional and what they're not. She does a pretty good job of making clear, just from the context, and sometimes in somewhat awkward ways, people coming across an article or people remembering things that their grandparents told them, and then kind of slipping into this more kind of capital H historical voice with dates and names and places. But I did find it frustrating that I couldn't look in the back and have a more clear picture of what was fiction and what was fact. So I just want to make clear a few of these ideas by looking at a couple of quick passages. So on page 262, we have an example of how she's mixing together fact and fiction. And this does give you a sense of, like, most of the time it is clear when she's talking about a fact or when something is fictive. But this also gives you a sense of, like, sometimes how it feels a bit awkward. So on 262, we have this. Lebensraum, that's in italics. I don't know. I think that's a German word. Lebensraum had begun to circulate as an idea when I was a young man. I first heard the word at the schoolhouse in Tobe, where our teacher explained that the expansion of an empire was not only natural but necessary, on scientific principles. German society was an organism, and it needed habitat, living space, to grow and to develop. Polish lands were Lebensraum for the German Reich. So this, again, like, sure, I mean, he heard this in the schoolhouse, but you also hear a bit about how that might feel a little bit contrived. And a few pages later, we actually have some very interesting information about the Pawnee people, but it's also an example of where the novel starts to feel more just like kind of a historical text. So we have, some Pawnee children attended a small residential school in Genoa, the Pawnee Manual Labor School. The headmistress, a white woman from New York named Elvira Platt, had taken up their cause. The boys were taught the proper habits of manual labor and agriculture, and the girls were trained to be domestic servants in white homes. She had dedicated her life to transmuting the Indians into peaceful and agreeable citizens, she told me at the depot. When you consider the vast tracts of land that we have taken from the Pawnees, an education is the least of what we owe them. She was vexed by the school's low enrollment. She could not understand why Pawnee parents refused to send their children to study the civilizing arts. So you can imagine that I love this. I'm very happy to learn that Elvira Platt was disgruntled because no one was coming to her school to be quote-unquote civilized. This is a very good example, actually, of the really compelling ways that Karen Russell is giving us actually a lot of history, and it's very provocative. And she's criticizing it in ways that really align with how I feel about this part of our history. But I think you also get the sense that this is reading a bit more like a history textbook. And certainly if you're going to contrast this, for example, and you don't even have to have read the book to understand this, when we are reading about the young Asphodel Olensky, known as Del Olensky, who is our young female basketball player, you know, when we're having long chapters about her basketball team, you know, at their practices in the dusty prairie and then their games, that stuff is all very fictionalized, and we are very clearly in the world of a teenager in 1930. So one of my issues is the way that the historical fiction piece of this can feel sort of jarring. It can feel kind of out of sync and a little disjointed, which again is why we are focusing on magic realism. And Russell herself articulates really clearly on page 405 at the very end of the book the ways in which magic realism does sort of function here in the novel. I am someone who will often go to the back of the book and see if there is a note from the writer or what they're saying in the acknowledgments, especially a book like this that's taking some risks and that's complicated in certain ways and is making big statements about history and including a lot of different elements. My sense is that I want to understand where these elements are coming from, how an author is shaping them, and any other important context. So on page 405, we have this. The Antidote uses fantastical conceits to illuminate the holes in people's private and collective memories, the willful omissions passed down generation to generation, and the myths that have been used by the U.S. government and white settlers to justify crimes against the citizens of native nations and the theft of native lands. One of the most destructive of these is the myth of terra nullius. There were dozens of native nations hunting and farming on the Great Plains long before the arrival of European colonizers. Although Utz, Nebraska, is an imaginary town, every non-Indigenous American in our country is living on American Indian homelands. So you can imagine how much I love this paragraph. this is, I think, the heart of the book, melted down into this one paragraph. One of my main problems is that this is the most interesting and I think most important thing the book is doing, and yet we don't get to it until a little bit late in the game. And it feels really diluted because it is on the same par, for example, as a young woman who is concerned about winning the basketball pennant. I don't know if it's a pennant. I don't think that probably isn't the right word. And that is slightly unfair because, of course, historical fiction wants to place these larger questions into the everyday lives of fictional characters. But I think my reaction there, my statement, is a result of the way that this doesn't feel as cohesive as it might. I also really enjoy this idea of fantastical conceits. I think in many ways that is another, it's another name for magic realism. Quick interjection here about fantasy novels. So the distinction between a fantasy novel and a novel that is an example of magic realism is that in a fantasy novel, the whole world is different. So you're not trying to have a realistic world that is mostly realistic with a few elements of supernatural. What you are doing in a fantasy novel, often there is a map. The map is actually very important. It signals to you that you are entering an entirely different realm. This is not even some place that is on Earth. So I think it's easy to understand the ways that fantasy, it has supernatural elements the same way that magic realism does. But in fantasy, the entire world is different versus a very, real, quote unquote, real fictional world that tries as hard as it can to be, exactly the same as our actual world. In the acknowledgments, she actually does give us some of what I was looking for in terms of like telling me what's real and what's not. But I found, and this is a good blueprint. I mean, when we read these elements in her acknowledgments in the back part of the book, we understand that the whole book is kind of this melding of fiction and history. But the way that she kind of zoomed in these two different parts at the end of the book in the acknowledgments and told us about these specific things left me sort of wanting, and it made me wish, in fact, that we did have a notes section that gave us a much better sense of fact versus fiction. So on 412, she says this: "The biographical facts of Zinkala Nooni's early life, including the dates of her incarceration at the Milford Industrial Home and the stillbirth of her child, come from published letters and secondary sources. The characters, dialogue, and scenes that occur inside this fictionalized Milford home are my invention." Then a little further down, "Several other characters in this novel share names and biographical facts with real historical figures, including Rory Stryker, Dorothea Lange, Arthur Rothstein, Asa Hill, and Elvira Platt." There's our friend Elvira. "This novel is an act of imagination based on research I've done and conversations I've had, but fundamentally fiction." So here we have this real acknowledgement in the acknowledgements about the fact that this is really fiction. What she's writing here is a piece of fiction. But I really wish that there were a notes section that would have tipped us off a little more clearly to what of this was fact. I think it's worthwhile to note, and is actually very interesting to me, that I was kind of hung up on this idea of like, what of this is fact and what of this is fiction. Those of you who've listened to the Fox page know that in many ways, this idea of fact versus fiction does not bother me. I'm not super uptight about like true story. So if we have Annie Ernaux and we have this idea of autofiction, which is very popular in France, this idea that you have a very novelistic memoir, or you have a memoir that has a lot of novelistic elements, if it is something that is not purporting to be history with a capital H, if it is not purporting to make big statements about our nation, it's much more palatable for me. If it is, even if it's Mary Karr, who's an incredible memoirist, I mean, I would put her kind of in an autofiction camp, largely because all of the details, I love her work. It's so compelling and it is so good, and it doesn't bother me at all that I'm like, wait, how does she have all of these details from when she was 7 years old? There's a lot of talk in MFA programs, it's emotionally true, or like you can think about memoir in lots of ways. I'm not particularly hung up on like everything being absolutely vetted for fact. But all of that has to do with like memoir, which is really very much about one person. It's one person's experience. What Karen Russell is doing here is very different. She's purporting to write something about the US government and about the genocide of an entire people. And in that case, I do care a bit more about like what of this is fictionalized and what of this is historical. And again, I just think that the whole thing would have benefited from a notes section in the back. And I don't think that would have been a ton of work. I don't know. I want to end today with just a quick return to the beginning, which is I think that Karen Russell with The Antidote is doing something really interesting. I think in some ways it's overly ambitious, but I really liked looking at it as an example of a kind of magic realist novel that is also kind of a historical fiction novel that is really doing a lot to bring awareness in all of these amazing ways that magic realism can do that to a very important question. In fact, it's not just the question of the Native peoples. And again, in my opinion, it's maybe too many different questions. But I hope that for those of you who are diving into The Antidote, or for those of you who have read it, that an understanding of the way that she is using magic realism is allowing you to parse a little bit more what is excellent about this book and what might not be working quite as well. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. Thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.